Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to the Institute for Government. My name is Tim Durrant, I'm a Programme Director here and I'm delighted to be hosting this event talking about how the government can learn from inquiries. On the 20th of November, a couple of weeks ago, the UK COVID-19 inquiry published its second report 4.5 years after it was set up by Boris Johnson. This report, which followed one in July on resilience and preparedness, focuses on political and administrative decision-making in the UK government during the pandemic, as well as the perspectives in the devolved administrations. Today we're going to be talking about that report, but also about inquiries more generally. We're interested in what this report reveals about how government operated during the pandemic, what the lessons of the report are for future governments approaching crisis management, but also what the COVID inquiry is teaching us about the need for reforming how inquiries are run and how the government could approach that challenge. We have a fantastic panel here to talk about all of these questions and more, so I'll introduce them starting from my right. So my colleague Vimbai Dzimwasha, who is a senior researcher here at the Institute for Government, Katie Lyons, who is a senior research fellow at the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, Jim Reid, who is a health reporter at the BBC, and Dr. Rebecca McKee, also my colleague here, senior researcher at the Institute for Government. We will kick off with a quick discussion among the panel and then have plenty of time for audience questions, both in the room and online. If you're online, you can add questions to the Slido already. Please do include your name if you and feel able to. We always have plenty of anonymous questions as well. If you're in the room, we'll come to questions soon. Please do start thinking of them. But I'm going to kick off with the panel. I'm going to go to Rebecca first. Rebecca, the COVID inquiry is one of many inquiries currently going on in the UK. Tell us a bit about the landscape of inquiries and within that, what stage the COVID inquiry is at.
Thank you, Tim. So I think it's kind of helpful to point out a little bit more of the context, zooming out from the COVID inquiry, of which the COVID inquiry is one of 25 inquiries that are currently going on across the UK. That includes 2 non-statutory inquiries, so the vast majority of those are statutory inquiries that are established under the Inquiries Act. Non-statutory inquiries include the Angelini inquiry, which I think published its report about 30 minutes before this, second report 30 minutes before this webinar, so I haven't looked at that. And I say across the UK because the governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all have the powers to establish their own inquiries. So there's 2 in Northern Ireland that are currently ongoing, there's 6 currently ongoing in Scotland, and there's actually one of the parliamentary committees in the Scottish Parliament looking at the cost effectiveness of inquiries, in part because they're also seeing kind of a growth in inquiries, a growth of cost and time taken of inquiries in Scotland as well. I just had a quick look before I came down, and there are 10 inquiries that have reported in the last 5 years, which I think speaks to this kind of other side of the context, which is what do you do with inquiry recommendations once they are published and once the inquiry ceases to exist, and what happens to those inquiries. There is variation between statutory and non-statutory, as I mentioned, which primarily is the powers to compel witnesses and evidence that in statutory inquiries have versus kind of the voluntary cooperation of non-statutory inquiries. But maybe in the Q&A we can get to talk about the Hillsborough law and like what that means kind of going forward for inquiries. But actually what really distinguishes them, because they can often look and feel quite similar, is what they're aiming to achieve. And there's a wide landscape of inquiries going on at the moment that all trying to do different things. So the COVID inquiry is this big, hefty statutory inquiry. It's a huge terms of reference. If you look at the kind of sub-clauses and the terms of reference of what it's meant to be looking at, it means it has a massive scope. There was a much earlier inquiry, which sits completely at the other end, is the Bishard inquiry, which was a very short non-statutory inquiry into the murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. That was quite a short inquiry. It wasn't chaired by a judge and did have significant impact on child protection procedures. There's other inquiries which are into kind of individual deaths. So there's Jermaine Baker inquiry. That's interesting as it began as an inquest and actually was kind of 7 years after the original incident that the later public inquiry actually published. And then, of course, the Hillsborough Independent Panel as a non-statutory inquiry that was held after several investigations, inquiries, inquests. And that was really tasked with examining the Hillsborough Stadium disaster and putting on the public record kind of the information and set of events that happened. So those are all sort of trying to do different things. Their form and function all looks a little bit different, which we'll probably get into a little bit more about that. But what I think that really raises, it's really key the way that inquiries are set up, and it's really key kind of what you do with inquiries kind of after they finish. There's also the whole bit in between of how they're run. But in terms of the COVID inquiry, so that was announced by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson in May 2021. About a year later, it launched and then began public hearings in June 2023. As I mentioned, it has a huge remit. So we are now in December 2025, the second of 10 modules. The chair decided to break them into 10, the remit of the inquiry into 10 modules. The second module has just been published. The inquiry is now taking oral evidence on the 9th module on the economic impact. So that's sort of where we're at. We're not expecting, each one of those is a final report for that module. So this is a kind of interesting approach. We're not expecting a sort of final report for the inquiry. So module 2, this is the final say that the inquiry will have on the content of module 2, which is quite an interesting approach. But we're then not expecting module 10's publication until into 2027, I think. So yeah, that's where we currently are.
So it's a long time to go. I'm interested in what you said about the kind of growth and proliferation, I guess, of inquiries. And can you talk a bit about the sort of public attitude towards inquiries? Has that changed over the last few years?
So I think there's a public attitude towards inquiries generally, which I think you have to situate within a wider context of low public trust in government, and particularly low public trust in some of the areas, especially healthcare settings or police interactions with the police, where there has been repeated failures and repeated attempts to kind of dodge accountability or not engage with various other types of investigation that might happen before an inquiry or instead of an inquiry. And so in that context, they are held in very high regard, and statutory inquiries in particular are seen as kind of a gold standard with the powers that they have to compel evidence and compel witnesses. And you can see why when there's been repeated attempts to try and get answers, that is the thing that people want to reach for. It's also sometimes the first thing people want to reach for because they've seen kind of what happens, and they statutory inquiries are very salient. There's a kind of underlying or another question, which is what's the public attitude to the COVID inquiry, which I don't have kind of definitive data on, but from the stuff I've read and people we've probably all been speaking to, as the last module came out and as the inquiry has been ongoing, I think there's a real sense that what is this going to do? This has taken so long. We all experienced the COVID pandemic. And some of us might feel like we had some of the answers already. Some organisations have done some work previously. So I think there's a real sense of it's taking a very long time and we're not quite sure what we're really getting out of it.
Great. Well, that's really helpful context. So I'm going to talk to Jim and Katie now about the COVID inquiry. Jim, you've been following the inquiry in depth. Tell us a bit about the inquiry's verdict from the most recent report on the early stages of the pandemic. What were the big themes there?
Well, as Rebecca said, it's split into these 10 sections, and each of the individual sections is pretty meaty. So we had the first report, actually not last summer, but the summer before, into the first section which looked at planning for a pandemic. And interestingly, when you speak to people involved in pandemic response and planning in the UK, that's the one they felt was the most important because it's the one we can learn the most lessons for in the future. This one, I think, is the one that the public are probably most interested in. And I know Katie's going to talk about this, but there's this kind of two things that an inquiry has to do. And one thing I think is to learn for the future. From a journalist's point of view, it also has to hold people to account for decisions that were made in the past. And that's, I think, what we found when we saw this report on the 20th. Just that report alone was more than 800 pages long. And the way it works is journalists and other interested parties are sort of invited in that morning and given the report to read, and then we have to broadcast at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. There is physically no way that you can read an 800-page report in the 3 hours that you're given. So you're having to sort of cherry pick what you think are the most interesting points. And I think that's important because what's come out of this is because it's so wide-ranging, people can pick the thing either that they're most interested in or they're most furious about or most upset about. And you see that in the press coverage, depending on whether the Telegraph are covering it or the Guardian are covering it. The Telegraph are going to go on that line of, were we pushed into lockdowns when we shouldn't have done? The Telegraph, the Guardian are going to go on a line that's critical, for example, of the previous Conservative government. As you see this all the way through. in terms of your question, going back to that, I think the one thing they wanted to get across, and they did, this gets missed in the nuance, but they did caveat it with these were not easy decisions for the politicians at the time, but overall, too little was done too late, and it was done, and you can repeat that argument at different points in the pandemic. And the report took you through this chronologically in the main. So too little was done before much political action was taken. So, when the virus first emerged in China, they talked about how February was this lost month when we could have done stuff that we didn't. Then when you move on to, I'm sure you'll remember those pictures coming out of northern Italy, and it was clear that something had to be done at that point. Two different points were made by the inquiry, and they're quite difficult to get across from a media point of view. One was that if we brought in, this is the argument, stronger voluntary measures earlier, they said much earlier, so I think they at least mean weeks earlier, then we could have avoided that mandatory, you have to now stay at home order on the 23rd. So that was one of the key criticisms. And they went as far as saying that mandatory lockdown could have been much shorter if that decision had been made, or potentially not made whatsoever. But once we got to that point on the 23rd, and those decisions, they argued, hadn't been brought in early enough, then it was the right decision, they said, to bring in the lockdown then, although it should have happened a week earlier. And they made this point, which is proved to be quite controversial, that by bringing it in a week earlier, mathematical modelling suggested that 23,000 lives could have been saved. Now, using that modelling, it's come out in the press afterwards, is quite a controversial. There are some people that would criticise the use of modelling in that way. And then very briefly, they go on to talk about the summer of 2020. You remember Eat Out to Help Out. They were quite critical again of some of these measures that were brought in, which they said undermined health messaging at the time. And then I think one of the key criticisms that's made in the report is you get into that autumn of 2020, and there they say it was inexcusable, that's their words, that the same mistakes tended to be made again, that everything was done too slowly, that a shorter circuit breaker lockdown should have been brought in, as some of the scientists suggested at the time. And they said as a result of that, it meant that a second lockdown, which had to be brought in, by this point we're in England, had to be an England lockdown on the 5th of November was therefore inevitable. One last thing I wanted to say is a lot of these criticisms, because this bit of the inquiry took evidence in London first and then went around the country, so went to Edinburgh, went to Cardiff and to Belfast. A lot of these criticisms are being made of the UK governments as a whole, not just of the Westminster government. But by the time we get to that autumn, different decisions are being made in different parts of the UK, and some of the criticisms are quite squarely placed at the Westminster government.
Thank you. That's a really helpful overview. I guess to pick up that last point, a lot of the criticisms were facing the Westminster government, and in particular, Boris Johnson, Matt Hancock, Dominic Cummings, they sort of loom large in the report. How much do you think this government is paying attention to what the report is saying and are trying to do things differently, or are they just saying, look, that was those guys, it's their fault, nothing to do with us? Well,
this is why it's quite difficult from a media point of view, because the recommendations that are made are probably very important. I think there was 16 of this in this second phase. But in the main, they are quite technical and about the way the government runs. So I think from a media point of view, the conversation is not going to be had in the media, because they are quite technical. One thing I wanted to say about that is, when you look back at Module 1, which looks at the planning for a pandemic, there were some recommendations there which are starting to have an effect. So one thing they said, for example, was that big pandemic planning, training exercises needed to be held regularly, I think every 3 years, they said, but also shouldn't be held behind closed doors. So we had this situation before 2020, when you had these series of exercises, things like Exercise Cygnus, Exercise Alice, and actually the conclusions of that were pretty prescient in that, for example, they were quite critical of the way that the response in care homes was run, which turned out clearly to be a massive deal. But we never found out about those criticisms because they were never published. And it was only actually through a leak, I think, to The Guardian, much later on in 2020, that these things came out. So the idea now is to run training exercises and publicly publish the results, which will give people on this panel and journalists a chance to kind of say, well, hang on a second, this doesn't seem to be working. They're in the middle of one at the moment called Exercise Pegasus, which is billed as the biggest pandemic training exercise ever to take place in the UK. They've done a kind of three stages of that actually this autumn, and they're going to do a fourth stage, I think, in the spring of next year. So I would say that there are kind of elements of learning which the government have put in place, but they don't get clearly the kind of press pickup the COVID inquiry would.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Katie, at the Bingham Centre, you have run an independent commission on UK public health emergency powers. Tell us a bit about that commission, what you found, and how you compare the themes that came out of that work with those in the inquiry.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So the commission was set up in 2022, chaired by a former Court of Appeal judge called Sir Jack Beatson. There were 12 commissioners with a real wide variety of experience, so some with public health expertise, both as practitioners but also as academics, some with legal expertise. The director of the IFG was one. We also had people with expertise of parliaments, thinking about policy making, and I led the research for the commission. The focus of the commission was on the rule of law dimensions of the COVID-19 response, but really crucially, thinking about the future and thinking about recommendations for the next public health emergency. And by rule of law, I mean the concept that laws should be clear and accessible, that they should be scrutinised by Parliament, that they should be stable, which means there shouldn't be too much discretion in how they're applied. And thinking about the themes between our commission and the COVID-19 inquiry, the COVID-19 inquiry's Chapter 13 of their second report looked at the legislative response, and a lot of the things discussed there were similar to those discussed by our commission. So, for example, how far public health legislation in the UK was adequately scrutinised by Parliament, how far laws were clearly communicated, and how appropriate enforcement was. Our commission also looked at what happened in Parliament in a bit more detail, so thinking about hybrid ways of working and also parliamentary committees, which the COVID-19 inquiry hasn't looked at. But by and large, I think in terms of identifying what went wrong, both our commission and the inquiry reached similar conclusions. So there was insufficient parliamentary scrutiny of government lawmaking, which led to this accountability gap. One reason for that is that there was an over-reliance in all four nations on the most urgent form of regulation-making power called the made affirmative procedure, which means that Parliament isn't able to scrutinise the legislation until after it's come into force. Of course, that's needed. That type of very fast lawmaking is needed but in a pandemic, but we found that there was over-reliance on that in some instances where it hadn't been justified. And also there was confusion in messaging about what the law actually was, as I'm sure we all saw through COVID-19, which led to issues in enforcement. Police shouldn't be enforcing public health advice, even though it's important to follow. It's not a legal requirement, and yet there were instances where the police were confused about what was law and what was advice, and which led to loss of trust in the police. And there were also difficulties with the police in enforcing these public health restrictions. Particularly, the police had to make quite difficult assessments around what's reasonable for people to do, assessing the public health risk in their local area. The police aren't really used to thinking about those types of questions, and it was difficult for them to have the data needed to make those types of decisions. So both our commission and the inquiry identified those issues. I think where we really diverged is in the depth and detail of recommendations. So in relation to the issues considered in Chapter 13 of the COVID-19 inquiry's report, the inquiry made 3 recommendations. We made 41. The inquiry might not have wanted to make that many, considering how huge it is. I don't think they want the government to have hundreds and hundreds of recommendations to implement, but I think with the recommendations that were made, I feel, and speaking on my behalf rather than the Commission, I feel like there was a lack of depth and detail to some of them. And so I was thinking, why did this happen? What was the difference between our Commission and the inquiry? And I came up with kind of 3 things that I think led to that difference in focus. I think partly it's the scope of each of our terms of reference. The inquiry's terms of reference were so broad. We had a very narrow focus looking at rule of law dimensions of the legislative response, parliamentary scrutiny and enforcement, which really allowed the Commission to dig into the details so much and have so many discussions about what recommendations were practical, really bounce ideas back and forth. We went back to policymakers and people who were giving us evidence to test the feasibility of those recommendations. Also, we were future focused from the very start. You kind of touched on this, the tension that can exist from setting out to really understand exactly what happened, a blow-by-blow account, and have accountability over what decisions were taken versus making recommendations for the future. And in order to make recommendations for the future, you need to know what happened in the past. But that wasn't our focus. We wanted to understand what happened, but our focus was really thinking about the future and thinking about recommendations for change, and potentially the inquiry had a different emphasis. And then my third point, I'm a lawyer, so this is maybe a bit controversial for me and my ilk, but the inquiry is staffed by lawyers. It's a team of barristers led by a judge, whereas our commission was incredibly interdisciplinary. And lawyers are very good at analysing evidence, trying to cross-examine people, getting to the truth of what happened, but they're not trained to think about policy recommendations and the difficulties in government of implementing recommendations or what happens in Parliament, whereas the interdisciplinary nature of our commission really allowed us to think about those things in detail and focus on future recommendations and not just on the past.
Brill, thank you. I mean, there's so much in there, isn't there? I think that point about how we ensure that recommendations are actually taken forward is something we want to come into in a bit more detail. But I guess in terms of the Commission, tell us a bit more about the sort of that interdisciplinary point, the different knowledge and skills and expertise that people are bringing, and do you think that's a potential model for inquiries going forward?
Yeah, so we had, as I mentioned at the start, a really broad range, 12 commissioners, all experts in their field, led by Sir Jack Beatson, who's a former Court of Appeal judge. And we had remarkably less divergences in views that you might expect for people coming with very, very different viewpoints. But actually, I think having that variety of viewpoints really allowed us, when recommendations were made, to test them properly. So, for example, someone with human rights expertise recommended including human rights experts on SAGE to try and include human rights perspectives in the government's, or try and promote the priority of human rights perspectives in the response. Whereas our public health people advised us that actually it might be quite jarring for public health professionals to then try and be confronted with a completely different way of thinking about things. Public health people do take into account human rights, of course, when they operate, but human rights law is not their usual mode of working. And actually having that on SAGE might also dilute SAGE's recommendations, and instead a separate body should be set up, and maybe we should bake into the legislation. Our legal experts advise some responsibilities and requirements for government to engage in consultation or to take recommendations from national human rights institutions into account, which was one of our recommendations. So I think that interdisciplinary approach allowed us to say, this is what we want to happen, bringing together all of these different viewpoints, what's the best way to achieve that? And our chair, Sir Jack Beatson, a few years ago gave a talk about whether judges were the best people to lead inquiries, and one point he raised for consideration is whether maybe a panel might be a better approach for some inquiries, where you have a judge, but you also have other experts on the panel with expertise related to the issues that the inquiry is considering.
Brill, that picks up some of the questions online, so we'll come to those in a second.
Great.
But I just want to go to Vimbai. So Vimbai, you work here at the IFG on our policy-making team. You've also been a civil servant. Tell us, what do you think are the most important lessons for policy-making that have come out of the inquiry so far?
Yeah, so I just briefly explain. So I've been looking at rapid policy making, either in response to crisis or non-crisis but urgent issues. And I think some of what's come out of the inquiry is very similar to what has been coming out of my research, but I'll focus on 4 lessons in particular. So the first one is about crisis governance. I think what the inquiry showed was we have a very robust crisis response system in COBRA, but it's not necessarily geared for prolonged or sort of this temporal uncertainty of how long you need to be working on policy and responding to the crisis. And so there's something here for government to consider, actually. How do you have a system that first responds to the crisis, but then slowly gears to a more long-term governance model, because that's where some of the issues on responsibilities and decision-making sort of suffered and came under pressure. So there's something there about the actual governance processes and systems that are set up. I think there's also something about the way we prepare. So, you know, we had, the government had run a few exercises on pandemic preparedness, but again, the focus was on influenza. I know the recent Pegasus has sort of emulated COVID, but there's something there of, are you preparing for a certain scenario and failing to recognize that when it meets reality, it will not be another COVID-like situation? And so actually, how do we use our scenario testing, our preparedness exercises to test a diversity of issues, or even to focus just on key principles of preparedness, irrespective of what the issue is? I think there's also on institutional memory. So there had been these exercises, but the lessons weren't maybe necessarily embedded across the system. And so how do we think about actually supporting civil servants and the government to draw on lessons? And I would be also on that point, to draw on lessons from other inquiries, not just the COVID inquiry, in part because there are common themes that come across in the inquiries around governance, around engaging stakeholders. And so can there be searchable repositories or, you know, simulation drills that try and actually embed and strengthen institutional memory? And lastly, as a policy-making team, we're very interested in the subject of left-behind groups and which are the groups that experience vulnerabilities but are not necessarily always considered in policy-making. And for me, I think one of the most powerful elements of this inquiry has been the focus on vulnerable communities. And what it's revealed is, if there's no one in the room championing these communities, their experiences aren't necessarily factored. And so there's a lesson here on how do we strengthen the mechanisms that currently already exist to factor in inequality, but maybe actually consider, are they the most appropriate when people are working at speed? Do you need to diversify the voices in the room? What are the mechanisms we can do that? So I think for me, the inquiry has pointed out to some common issues that we maybe find in government, but also helped us identify where we need to go further. So thinking about crisis governance, thinking about how we prepare for scenario testing and how we use that effectively, how we strengthen institutional memory, and then how to always keep inequality in the back of our minds, because that has been, I guess, one of the lasting impressions of the COVID inquiry.
Brill, thank you. Really, really interesting stuff. I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that have come out of everyone's points. So one of them, I think, is about this leadership point of different models. You know, should we have a panel leading an inquiry, for example? Someone online has referred to the Hine review of the 2009 swine flu response, which was led by the former Chief Medical Officer of Wales. They say the recommendations failed to prepare us for COVID, but should the next outbreak inquiry be expert-led? Rebecca, maybe, I don't know if you could talk about sort of some of the different models or ways that this has been done, and the role that the chair or potential chairs play in sort of defining how an inquiry works.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this has really risen to prominence most recently with the fallout from the grooming gang inquiry that has been announced but has yet to kind of launch, where there was a disagreement between people involved in the panel that's kind of supporting the establishment of the inquiry, who are victims and survivors of grooming gangs, as to who should lead it. And so I think that has really made this a lot more of a visible question. The majority of inquiries that happen now are chaired by judges, and there's multiple different reasons why that's happened, partly because inquiries have become much more legalistic processes with people kind of getting lawyered up. And so there's benefit in having somebody who understands a very complex legal process, understands how lawyers work, and can kind of project manage that, I suppose. There's also, I alluded to this before, in this context of very low trust. People trust judges and their impartiality. And that was one of the issues around the grooming gang inquiry, in that the two people kind of on offer were connected to the kind of to the systems that have basically failed victims. So you then kind of get this pitting judge-led against kind of like policy expertise. And I think what this really highlights is kind of two things, which is there's not one right chair for every inquiry, right? So there are times when you do want a judge who can really, like Katie said, can kind of really bring alive like what happened and kind of get answers, and you need more of a kind of courtroom style hearing. There are other inquiries where you definitely want to have people involved, either as the chair or as panel supporting the inquiry, who really understand the policy area. They know that if you pull this lever, that thing happens. They know, what organisations have done historically and how they act now. There's just that lot more depth of understanding of kind of what's happening in that policy area. And then there's other inquiries where, for example, the Hillsborough panel was led by the Bishop of Liverpool, who I think that was quite important to have kind of a figure in Liverpool who could, again, that inquiry was trying to just bring forward and put on the public record a lot of that evidence. So there's kind of different roles that they can all play. I think the second part of that is that this early, when you're establishing an inquiry, it's incredibly important for when the government is leading that process, because although it's an independent process, it is a process that is established. The ministers establish inquiries, whether they are statutory or non-statutory. It's getting that right and making sure the government can defend its decisions. If you want to have a certain type of chair, why is that? What will this inquiry look like? What are the pros and cons, and what are you actually driving at? And when you're involving victims, survivors, people who are impacted by the events in that early process, making sure you can bring them along. There's often tension between what the government sees as like the purpose of an inquiry and maybe what people impacted by it want. But that doesn't mean that one of those groups needs to kind of go away or be ignored. It's a complete failure of the government if you can't make that work and actually defend your decisions and make sure you're picking the right person. So yeah, there's merits to different types of chairs. There's merits to different models. Again, like having more policy expertise supporting either like kind of specialist advisors like you would have on a parliamentary committee, for example, or the approach that the Commission took, I think is really interesting, having that interdisciplinary expertise. So you can shortcut some of those decisions rather than publishing a recommendation and everyone going, actually, that wouldn't work, or that would be really weird to have human rights lawyers in SAGE. You're really unpicking all of that early on, so that what you're producing is as close to as off-the-shelf, like oven-ready recommendation as you can, because we'll talk about this a bit more, but that the greater distance there is between the recommendations and kind of the appetite for ministers to pick this up, the more likely everything is just to get left on the shelf.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, let's come on to recommendations in a bit, but I just want to pick up on what Vimbai was saying about sort of the vulnerable communities and people who are at risk of sort of missing out. And Jim, I wonder if you could talk about this a little bit. So Vimbai mentioned about the importance of ensuring that inquiries reflect kind of everyone. Rebecca was talking about the challenges of involving sort of the victims or survivors of particular events. Obviously, COVID affected everyone. How much do you think the COVID inquiry has been thinking about this and comparing it potentially to other inquiries that you've sort of followed? How well has it done that?
When you speak to victims groups involved in COVID, and they're very well organised, there's separate groups representing bereaved families for the UK and then for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. One of their chief criticisms is they have not been involved enough in giving evidence to this inquiry. So they've tried to get around that. It's a compromise for the inquiry because it's already under pressure as being, too large, too bloated, going on too long. So it's got that kind of pressure on one hand. On the other hand, it's getting pressure for not including enough people in giving live evidence in witness hearings. So it's tried to get around that by running a kind of video section at the beginning of each part of the inquiry, which is about 15, 20 minutes long, which hears some of those voices. And then it generally tends to call evidence from 3 or 4 people who've been directly affected. Now that is very, very different, and then it goes on to expert evidence. That is very different from, say, the infected blood inquiry, which I covered in a lot of detail. And that was really a part of its reasoning, I think, was to allow people who felt they'd been very, very hard done by the state to come forward and essentially give their evidence in court. It wasn't quite in court, but you know what I mean. So there was months and months and months of evidence hearings from individuals coming forward and talking about that. And I think you saw that with infected blood. I was going to make this point. So they ran the overall inquiry, and it was judge-led by a guy called Sir Brian Langstaff, former High Court judge. And then there was criticism that the government hadn't responded quickly enough to some of the findings. So the judge then brought the Prime Minister at the time, Rishi Sunak, back to give special evidence in a huge room in Westminster where there were probably 200 or 300 families in that room. Now that is really holding someone to account, you know, that they were under, that was putting pressure on the government directly. And then further on, so this was, you know, after his final report had been made, when I think he felt that the pace of compensation was too slow, again, he brought back MPs to give evidence. And that got quite a lot of coverage in the press. We were there, the BBC, there was people with cameras outside. So in a way, it's kind of using these, theatrical is not the right word, but it's using these events to try to bring the government to account, I think, and get the media involved as well. But you haven't really seen that with COVID because of the way it's run slightly separately as more of a kind of lessons learned activity rather than being focused on the victims.
Brill, thank you. So that's a nice segue into my final question before I open up. But so on this point about how you ensure that what the inquiry recommends actually happens, Vimbai, you talked about government not being very good at embedding lessons. Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of how you think that should be managed and potentially from your experience in government, having seen sort of the other side of these kind of exercises?
Yeah, I think to pick up on Jim's point, there's something about a dialogue. So actually, how do we make recommendations, either as the Commission did, Kate was saying about the Commission, and actually encouraging people who might have to respond to these recommendations to be in the room and participate in designing them, but also how do you then continue a dialogue of just sense checking of where are we, what's the progress that's being made, I think is a good one. I think there's something about the pace at which this is happening, where lessons learned are like, at least with this module, where it's after the fact, people have moved on, and so how do we encourage lesson learning during the moment, either in an iterative test and learn type approach? Agile policy making is one of my big things at the moment, of how do we replicate some of those principles and actually encourage people as it's happening to take some time. Is this going right? What do we need to change? Because as we all may be aware, people move on, the focus moves on elsewhere, and so how do you keep drawing attention back to the discussion, or at least capture it when it's still live? I think from what I've seen in government, I think there's also something about the tone being set from the very top, either that's by ministers or by some of the senior officials, of before we start this new exercise or before we start this new project, what happened previously? Can we apply some of those learnings? And I've seen that being done very effectively with the Environment Improvement Plan, which the latest one was actually published yesterday, where there was a discussion beforehand of, we did this before, what should we do differently? But that tone was set at the very beginning by senior officials. So I think there is something about the tone being set from the very beginning, encouraging dialogue and continually allowing for sense checking.
Well, thank you. And final word, Katie. I mean, you mentioned 41 recommendations. Tell us, how is the Commission thinking about sort of following those up and working with people in government and the broader system to push those forward?
Yeah, well, we from the very start tried to make sure we were talking to policymakers before we'd even really started our research, to make sure that we were on their radar and we were independent, so we weren't influenced in terms of what we looked at by what they told us, but we could get a sense of what might be practical, what areas were already being looked at, which areas would benefit from our scrutiny. In terms of implementation, it's tricky with the Commission model because we're reliant on funding to do any of our work, and it's easy, well, it's maybe not easy, but it's attractive to fund a commission that investigates and reports, and but there needs to be follow-up work to try and get the recommendations implemented. So we're continuing to try and put that work into action. We're continuing to try and have dialogue with the policymakers. But I think that's always that implementation effort is always more difficult, particularly, and I've noticed the government's done this differently with the COVID-19 inquiry, but particularly when many recommendations wouldn't be public if they were implemented. They might be changes behind the scenes that wouldn't necessarily be easily seen to have changed. Whereas I know the government you'll be able to speak about this more, maybe Rebecca, has now got a website where they are showing recommendations, inquiries they've made since 2024 and the status of their implementation, which I think is really, really useful in keeping track of what is actually happening behind the scenes.
Brill. Thank you very much. I'm going to open up for audience questions. We've got several online, but if there are questions in the room, please do stick up your hand. We have a microphone. Tell us who you are if you're able to.
Hi, yeah. My name is Reese. I work with CT Group. So a question I have is, are the findings of inquiries and proceedings, the way they work, are they communicated to the public in an effective way? Or are inquiries being used now more as political vehicles, which may be damaging the public trust of them?
Brill, thank you. Great question. Any more in the room? Rebecca, I might ask you to opine on that one,
Yep.
And then I'll come to some online.
Yeah, great. So I think they're done differently by different inquiries. If we think about the COVID inquiry, I mean, Baroness Haller decided not to do a press conference and instead did a kind of statement to camera that went live at the same time that the report was published, which I think I believe is a deliberate decision that's reflective of how she sees herself as a chair, but is also trying to communicate and speak directly to people who are impacted by it, or policymakers and etc., and not make that political. I think that's quite a deliberate choice, and that's another way of kind of getting the recommendations across, which is very different from an 800-page report, which is a lot harder for most people to kind of find the time to read, or it is much harder, like you're saying, Jim, about for the media to translate those effectively and translate all the nuance. So there definitely is a movement now for inquiries to be much more like people-centred. And part of that is around communication. I don't think they always get it right, and it is quite difficult thinking about all your different audiences and who you want to speak to and the different types of outputs that you want to have for all of those people. The concern is that you can lose your messaging in that, and that so you don't want to look like you're saying explicitly different things to different types of people. But I think there is a bit of a movement and a bit of a change. Just even having inquiry websites that are very clearly set out with links and very directional about where people should go to find information. They're so much clearer now than if you go back and look at some of the older archived websites. Which I think is definitely a deliberate thing. This links to a point which I meant to make earlier, and I think underpins some of this other stuff, which is we're just not learning enough best practice between inquiries. It would be fascinating to go and speak to some of the inquiries that have recently reported and say, how did you approach your comms plan? Like, how did you involve people in that? What were the considerations you had? And write that up. There are meant to be kind of lesson learned documents that are submitted to the Cabinet Office, but I believe like one or two of those have been actually submitted. But it would be interesting to kind of break that down into some like interesting bits of, some of it is very technical. How did you set up your IT systems? But actually, how did you communicate with people throughout and at the end? But there's not enough of that learning that's going on.
And I think it's also fair to say, isn't it, that often, as well as the sort of structures of the inquiries, the content of inquiries, there's a lot of similarities between them, but because they're all set up to deal with a specific issue and led by a specific person, and actually, sort of poor communication, poor data, lack of institutional memory, these are challenges that bedevil governments across lots of different issues and cause problems for all different aspects of public services. So actually, can inquiries be learning from each other in terms of the content as well as how they run themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Jim, I don't know if you have anything to add on this point about public comms.
It's a really good question. I think it depends on the type of communication you're talking about. So, like on the day that the inquiry report was published, as well as it being the lead item on, say, the 10 o'clock news, where you are having to summarise an 800-page report in 2.5 minutes. You just cannot. There's no way you can. But at the same time, the BBC does have other outlets like things like newscast and podcasts, which I think I was working on that on the day, and I think there was a good 20 minutes, half an hour devoted to just talking about it. So I do think we get into the detail of it all. I think some of the issue is that the actual recommendations are quite dry. So trying to get those across to I'm just kind of looking at a list in front of me here. We're talking about things like greater parliamentary scrutiny of emergency powers, better structures to improve communication. They're all really important. But frankly, that's never going to make headlines in the same way as criticism of Dominic Cummings or Boris Johnson is going to make headlines. So it is that sort of tension in the media as well as that tension in the inquiry as well. I'm not quite sure how to resolve that, but I do kind of think as time goes on, we do devote more to it in other ways that aren't just the straight news headlines.
Brill, thank you. Right, I'm going to come to some more of the online questions. Vimbai, I'm going to send this to you if that's all right. So someone anonymous has asked, in extremely difficult political decisions, for example, life versus liberty, how can any cool-headed retrospective inquiry really make A, fair criticism, and B, recommendations that future leaders in crisis will actually pay attention to?
Wow, that's a
big question.
That's a big question. I think so. I'll lean on the inquiry here. I think it does, in its the report actually talk about fundamentally people were having to make life or death decisions, and that's very difficult. But there's something about how much are we preparing and doing the simulations and the scenario planning and actually testing the decision-making framework people would use. So that's less. It's never going to, when it meets the reality and you're having to make that decision, it's never going to be the same. But can we be equipping ministers with the skills and the experiences as to help them when that arises, and to actually know here's the process I would follow, and just making sure that is fit for purpose, with the hope of that does allow for a cool-headedness, because there is something underpinning the decision-making you're making. But yeah, it is a very difficult thing, and it's easy to sit here and say it's just all down to preparedness, but that is fundamentally all you have before a crisis, is how well have you prepared, and can you call up that preparedness in the moment.
Bro, thank you. Question from Keith Rafford, which I'm going to punt this way as well. So, how does the UK's COVID inquiry compare to those in other countries? What lesson can we learn from theirs? Rebecca, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so we, as part of the research that I've been doing with the team at the IFG, we have looked at a few places that do public inquiries similarly enough that we can kind of draw lessons, because not everybody does. And they have taken different approaches. I mean, context matters. Because I'll talk about New Zealand, they had a very different COVID experience. But in New Zealand, for example, they reformed their public inquiry framework in around 2013. And basically, most inquiries now are statutory, but there is a sort of framework of, I think, royal commissions, public inquiries, government inquiries. And the idea is there's a ton of guidance that underpins that kind of ministerial decision-making, so that you can kind of pick the best tool for the job. And they all are kind of explicitly have different timelines, and they have different costs often associated with them. So the way that they did it, they ran a public inquiry. It was a lot shorter, a lot sharper. But they have a bit more of a history of kind of picking the right tool and having those early trade-off discussions about what this inquiry is actually for and how will it be set up. The other model that we looked at is in the Netherlands. So the Dutch Safety Board ran a few kind of investigations there, basically trying to pick up on some very specific things of what happened in COVID. And I think that has been largely successful at really getting into some of the really useful recommendations that can be implemented. The Dutch Safety Board, the OVV, has some specific powers that basically allow it to, day one, go in and investigate and get evidence and go into sites and see stuff, which I think is very important. In those contexts, though, we do have the issue that although I think some of those investigations were very successful at pulling out some important recommendations and lessons for government, maybe in part because they were so quick. There's now a call for kind of other types of investigation, other types of inquiry, kind of parliamentary inquiry into bits that maybe they didn't pick up on. And maybe in part because our COVID inquiry has been so long, that's not going to happen, or it's been so extensive. I would just say that just because we're looking at kind of what other models of inquiry in other places, we actually do run inquiry. We have a very good inquiry model here in the UK, and it's not like we have loads and loads and loads to learn from other places. I actually think fundamentally, the kind of inquiries in the UK are good and they run well and they can be effective. It's just they've been allowed to kind of mission creep. They've been allowed to get too big and too clunky. We're not learning enough from each other, and actually those are things we can kind of conclusions we can come to here. There's some to learn, but it's not like we need to overhaul the entire system, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. Kate, I don't know if there's anything in your Commission's work on Parliament. Did you look at other parliaments, whether within the UK or overseas?
Yeah, I was going to actually talk about the international. So talking about learning lessons from international experience, the Commission looked at 10 other jurisdictions. And because COVID-19 was kind of this unique event where all across the world you had examples of how governments responded, how parliaments responded, what legislation was passed. And the Commission has found that incredibly helpful in helping see which issues occurred over and over again in different countries, and so might be quite difficult to solve. Which countries had useful models that could be adapted and applied to the UK, although it's always tricky when, no matter how similar a country's kind of parliamentary and constitutional system is, there are always going to be differences that make a perfect mapping tricky, but it was really helpful to have that point of comparison. And I was wondering whether that, when you do have events like COVID or issues that aren't just a problem in the UK, that international focus can also be incredibly helpful. Although, taking Rebecca's point, I don't want to expand inquiries' remits even further, but we found that helpful.
Were there any that stood out as sort of, any parliaments that stood out as particularly sort of rapid in their responses or innovative?
We were hoping when we went into it that we would find the perfect model that we could just copy across into the UK, but that wasn't the case. Everywhere struggled with often similar issues around accountability, which is almost inevitable, you think, when you're legislating that quickly around clarity of legislation. Although New Zealand, our experts from New Zealand said that their legislation was very clear because it was very, very simple. But that New Zealand, they told us, had a history of legislative drafting where legislation just focuses on the broad principles, and there's low levels of enforcement, at least in COVID-19. So there wasn't kind of an issue around, if you have those broad principles, will the police just then overreach their duties? We found some good examples of intergovernmental cooperation. So Belgium had a very strong intergovernmental working, but that was quite rare. Lots of countries really struggled. Countries where there are devolved or federal structures really struggled with having a coordinated response. So I don't think there was a perfect response. In some ways, it actually made us more optimistic about how the UK had responded when we looked at other countries.
That's always good to know. I want to come back to the room. Is there any more questions here? There's plenty more online, but if people do... Brilliant, thank you. Mike's on its way.
Hi, I'm Sam McBain. I'm from RAND Europe. I was really interested by the point that I think you made, Vimbai, about introducing an institutional memory, or how do we establish that? And I just wanted to know where you think that would, where would that come from, who would drive that, and how dependent is that on a sort of government's receptiveness to installing something like that?
Great. Any more questions from the floor? One here. There we go. Okay.
Hi, thanks. Rachel with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. My question more relates to the societal impact that has happened for COVID and the loss of trust. And assuming that these lessons learned are applying it to a baseline of trust, which we no longer have, we've seen it degrade significantly from the onset of COVID. How does the inquiry maybe learn from that, or be able to account for the lessons learned, the recommendations for now a degrading level of trust, knowing that the response won't be the same as when we started COVID?
Brill, thank you. And then one over here.
Hi, Matt and civil servant. Questions about, when inquiries are set up, there's obviously like a desire for kind of truth, accountability, reconciliation. But then on the other kind of side of it, there's obviously a cost that comes with inquiries, and there are, a number of inquiries ongoing in the UK. So how good do you think we are at kind of balancing those two sides? Do you think we almost, on the one hand, do we have too many, or have there been missed opportunities for inquiries in certain situations as well?
Brill, thank you very much. Vimbai, do you want to go first on Sam's question about institutional memory?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I should sort of clarify that I think there are pockets of good practice within government, as with most things, where there's pockets, and so it's more about how do you transform that into a standard practice. And I wonder, this is might answer your question, but not really. One of the things that struck me with the recommendations is they're always very technical, which is what an inquiry is supposed to do, and it focuses on process. But there's something that's missing, which is just about the culture. And so the question of institutional memory, for me, is very much on the culture of how do we culturally, how does the civil service change in that regard? And I wonder if some of this is more about are there expectations after an incident, right? So it's not just about what do we do at the start, what do we do as the crisis is happening, but how do we then exit the crisis and learn from it and embed it. There's also an encouragement at the very beginning of has this happened before or something similar, and how can you apply that, and actually testing that among civil servants. So is it a question of senior officials again holding the mantle to say, have you considered X report or X lessons learned document? And there's also something about in the preparation exercises where it's not necessarily just about how would we respond to X crisis, but how have we prepared using the lessons from before. So I think there's just, the mechanisms already exist, it's just about how making them commonplace, and there's something about the behaviors and the questions we're asking people before, during and after a crisis is sort of how I would go about doing that.
Brill, thank you very much. Jim, I wonder if you would take the second question about kind of how much the COVID inquiry is considering the impact of pandemic on trust in government and whether or not they're making recommendations in that context.
I was just thinking about that question, and it's a really good one. I kind of think different inquiries have dealt with that in different ways. And it's where you position yourself as the chair of the inquiry. So maybe it's just me, but I kind of felt covering the infected blood inquiry that the chair and the council were taking not so much a position, but an attitude of being essentially on the side of the victims. Part of their kind of reason for being really was to give voice to the victims. Now, obviously, it's much easier to do that with something like the infected blood scandal, which is 30 years, 40 years old, and no one watches at that scandal and thinks that there can be anything other than a failure of the state. It's more difficult when you're talking about something like COVID. I do think what they've tried to do is position themselves to a certain extent as the sort of voice of the public. So there's a couple of examples there. So for example, do you remember right at the beginning, there was the whole thing about trying to get hold of WhatsApps and messages from politicians. And at one point, I think it was the Cabinet Office or the government pushed back and said, we're not going to hand these things over. And Baroness Hallett took it to court and won. And then Rishi Sunak was given quite a hard time in the inquiry when he came out and said that all of his WhatsApps have been deleted. So again, it's that kind of sense of kind of speaking for the public. And we saw it again. There was a module that looked at PPE, and there was a whole day devoted to PPE MedPro, which is the company that was essentially controlled by Michelle Moan's husband, and that all had to be held behind closed doors because of an ongoing National Crime Agency investigation. But they still invited people like me and other journalists in. We just can't report on the findings or what was said that day until the end of that part of the investigation. But it would be easier for the inquiry to say, oh, we're just going to back away from dealing with that really controversial subject. Yet they kind of went ahead and do it. So it's kind of signalling things like that, I think, that you're on the side of, essentially on the side of the public here. Now, whether they've done that enough is a kind of a different question, but that's what they're attempting to do, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. And then, Rebecca, maybe that last question from Matt about, do we have too many inquiries and do they balance the costs and benefits properly?
So we have a report that should be out before Christmas, which covers an awful lot of this, but I will give you a whistle-stop tour. Yes, I think we have too many, and that doesn't mean that I think that serious issues that have impacted people shouldn't be investigated. One of the problems is there's a massive failure of some of the earlier bits of administrative justice to pick up on this effectively. So we have, there's some inquiries, mental health inquiry into what's happened in a hospital in Essex, for example, that started off as a review but needed more powers and kind of needed to be expanded. Or, for example, Hillsborough is one of those examples where we said repeated failures at kind of getting accountability and getting at the truth. So that's one part. The other part is we are not learning lessons. So the House of Lords report from 2024 pointed to a couple of instances where if recommendations from one inquiry had been implemented, you would basically not need to have another inquiry that was ongoing. And so I think those are the two things. We have too many because we're not doing those kind of things. The other thing is they are too broad. Some of them are too broad. And I think the COVID inquiry is one of the ones we can point to, is trying to do too many things for too many different types of people, which means it's not really doing, I mean, this is one of the bits that we care most about, but the lesson learning for government, which is, I think, been a major problem because a lot of lesson learning internally has then kind of been put on hold within the civil service and in government and has really stalled. And the other thing is that they are taking too long. And a caveat to this is some inquiries need to be bigger and some inquiries need to take that long, but most of the inquiries don't. And there's a whole load of kind of like underlying drivers of why this is happening. One of these is, I think is really key, is when they're established and ministers not being equipped to kind of have those difficult conversations about what the trade-offs are with people impacted and with the people involved in the inquiry. You know, if we go down this route, we will have this type of inquiry and get there a bit quicker. If we go down this route, we will have this type of inquiry and it will look like this. And the point I made before about they're not good enough at like learning from each other, which also links to the point about there's not enough innovation going on. You know, it's a risky thing starting an inquiry on an incredibly devastating topic. It means a lot to people, and then kind of when you end. And that means that we're not encouraging innovation. We're not encouraging kind of, I guess, risk-taking in kind of the ways in which inquiries can be run. And that needs to be underpinned by this kind of like lesson learning and kind of the role of the Cabinet Office team. I would just say the government has made some progress on this. So a Hillsborough law we haven't talked about, but I think is really interesting and is a completely new initiative internationally, which has a duty of candour with a supplementary kind of duty to assist. And then some things there about legal aid for people impacted as well. But that the design of that is meant to make inquiries quicker because it kind of brings disclosure up front. There's something there about position statements as well that should help to kind of speed up that process. And also means that people are kind of compelled to engage with the inquiry for non-statutory inquiries as well. And then there was also a small but important change of recently, basically the ministers now need to consult the Cabinet Office team when they launch inquiries, which you might think was already happening, that the Cabinet Office Public Inquiries team was always being engaged in decisions and setting up inquiries, but is not the case. So there's some stuff that's happened and there's some stuff that needs to go further, but completely agree with that diagnosis. There's too many, they're too broad and they're taking too long and then by default costing too much. And then by default, having a massive impact on public trust in these areas. So, and some stuff had been done, but I think we could go a lot further.
Well, thank you. Katie, I want to give you the last word. Is there anything you would pick up on from what people have just said in those questions? Or if not, what would your one recommendation be from the Commission to the inquiry on how to do this kind of thing better?
Oh gosh. I think the interdisciplinary point that I made earlier, I know the inquiry did receive expert evidence from a number of different people, but I think at the point that recommendations are being made, being able to have that interdisciplinary experience in the room to bounce things back and forth. And in some of the Bingham Centres Commission, there's another one, they've had 3 former politicians in their commission, which is so helpful to think about practicality. So I don't know how much discussion there is behind the scene between inquiries and government and policymakers about the recommendations and getting feedback, but I think that's a really, really useful thing to do.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think that's a great point to end. So I will close here. As Rebecca mentioned, we will be publishing a report later before the Christmas break on establishing public inquiry, so keep an eye out for that. There'll be a video and sound recording of this event available on our website and YouTube shortly afterwards, so do please pass it on. And I will just ask you to join me in thanking the panel. Thank you very much.